Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is grieve. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or ways that we use this verb. The first way you're most likely to hear the verb grieve used is to mean to feel grief for or because of someone or something. You're probably noticing there in the definition, or the first definition of this verb, we have the word grief, which is going to be the noun form of the word, and which we'll look at a little bit later. Think of this as very deep sadness. Okay? Many times we use this word to talk about our feelings after someone has passed. And I shared in yesterday's video that I recently lost a very, very dear friend of mine. And so this has been a verb that has been on my mind recently. A second way you might hear the verb grieve used is to mean to cause great distress to someone. I've got an example sentence of that a little later that might help us illustrate that definition. But again, the first one is the more common usage for this particular verb. You should know that grieve is a regular verb. To make the progressive tense, we need to drop the E and then add ing to form grieving. The past tense and participle forms of this verb are made by just adding the letter D, since this verb already ends in an E. The base verb, grieve, ends in this voiced V sound. So our past tense ending is going to make a D sound. Grieved, grieved. There is one phrasal verb that tends to be used. I'll note, though, the definition isn't extremely different than the first or primary definition we looked at, but you may hear someone talking or saying that they grieve for someone or something. And again, the meaning here is to experience an intense feeling of sadness due to a particular loss. And sometimes it's just a change. It doesn't mean have to mean that someone has died. There are many different things that people can and do grieve. Let's take a look at an example of this phrasal verb in a sentence. Our country has grieved for far too many people who have died from COVID-19. So you'll see here, this is an example of the present perfect, and it's talking about an action that started in the past and unfortunately continues into the present as many people still continue to contract or catch COVID-19, and unfortunately too many have also died as a result. We're going to continue to practice using our verb grieve in the simple past tense and the present progressive. Today, we'll start with the simple past. And the thing to remember about this verb tense is that you want to use it when you're speaking about a completed action that occurred at a definite time in the past. You might see time signals in a sentence like yesterday, last month, 5 years ago, right? And that's telling us a definite time. But they're not always stated in a sentence. It could be implied as part of a paragraph or a larger passage. It might also be implied as part of your conversation with another person. So let's take a look at an affirmative example. Here, the thing I'll note is we're going to use that ending with a D, and that is true no matter what our subject is. It grieved me to think you were all alone and without help. So this particular usage is tying back to that second definition I mentioned. Not as common. So in this particular sentence, someone is maybe saying they were upset, they're bothered by this idea, but it's not like a sadness about a death or a loss. Now let's take a look at a negative simple past sentence. To do this, we're going to use did not and then the base verb. So remember, no ed ending in the negative or in questions. I'll point out, though, you might hear some speakers use the contraction form didn't. Here's an example. The family didn't grieve alone. So this is implying that many people were sad and they were feeling that sadness probably together. Now let's look at making a yes or no question. To do this, we're going to start with did, then we'll have our subject, and then the base verb. Did she grieve for the loss of independence after her accident? So here, someone might be extremely sad and upset because perhaps she was no longer able to walk, or maybe she lost the use of an arm or some other part of her body. Now, let's take a look at the present progressive. You may remember we're using this verb tense to talk about something that is happening right now or an action that is in progress. To make this verb tense, we're going to use a present form of be. And that's going to change based on what our subject is. So if our subject is I, we'll use am. If our subjects are he, she, or it, we'll use is. And if our subjects are you, we, or they, we'll use are. Here's an example sentence. But I should say, after the be verb, we want to use the ing form of the verb. They are still grieving the loss of their grandmother 2 years after her death. And I think this is a good sentence for us all to be aware of and think about, that when we lose someone, that loss can stay with us for a very long time. It's not just that we're sad for a day or two or a week and then we're all better. Now, if you want to make a negative present progressive sentence, you want to insert not after your be verb. Here's another example. I'm not grieving all the time. This is also true, right? We might have really happy moments, fun moments, but then we can also have these really intense sad feelings and sad moments as we deal with the loss of a loved one. If you want to make a yes or no question, what you want to do is start with a be verb. Then we'll have our subject and then the ing form of the verb. Here's an example. Are you grieving a loss? This is a really broad question. It doesn't necessarily have to just be referring to the loss of a human being, a relative, or a friend. Could be a loss of something else. Many people grieved the loss of freedom that came with the pandemic. We were no longer able to go out or socialize with our friends, and that was a loss for many people. Now, let's take a look at some words that are related to our verb grieve. And I've already mentioned the noun grief. This can have a couple different meanings. One is, again, deep sadness or sorrow. And we, again, tend to use this particular noun to describe our feelings, these deep feelings of sadness after someone has passed. Here's an example. We have all felt a tremendous amount of grief this week. This might be a sentence someone says on behalf of family or a group of people who are all mourning the loss of a loved one. Now, there is a second way to use this noun, grief, and it's not nearly as sad. It just means trouble or annoyance. So let me give you an example of how I've heard this used. And you have to imagine a mom or a dad saying this to their children. Kids, don't give the babysitter any grief. So don't give them trouble. Follow the rules, mind your manners, etc. Behave is another way to say don't give them grief. Griever, as a noun, is a person who is experiencing grief. Here's an example of this noun in a sentence. Grievers gathered at an outdoor memorial service yesterday. So you can see the S on the end of this noun. So now we're referring to two or more people who are experiencing grief. I really hope you aren't experiencing grief or that you aren't grieving someone right now. But perhaps if you are, you've got some new vocabulary to sort of express those emotions and describe what's going on in your life. I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you have a great day.